Hola Ed, buenos días, ¿cómo estás? Muchos de nuestros espectadores no se sorprenderán de saber que Suecia tuvo su baby boom, eso sí, una década anterior al español, pero quizás se sorprendan de saber que pocos años después de que los baby boomers estuvieran ya escolarizados, las autoridades suecas empezaron a ahorrar para afrontar el extracoste que sabían que décadas más tarde el baby boom iba a ocasionar en el sistema de pensiones, como así se ha venido comprobando desde 2010 aproximadamente. ¿Qué pasó exactamente? ¿Qué es lo que generó? ¿Cómo y cuándo Suecia empezó a ahorrar para afrontar el extracoste de pensiones de los baby boomers?
Okay, well, I think it's a very interesting story because before World War II, in a sense, the country was prepared for this because there was a pretty large debate at the time between the Liberal Party and the Social Democratic Party. And the Social Democratic Party actually won the elections at that time and even many decades thereafter. But the interesting thing is that in this discussion, there were two persons who were professors in economics. And actually both of them ended up getting the Nobel Prize eventually. But one of them, Gunnar Myrdal, and this is an important part of the background, and his wife Alva, she was a co-author, and they were very focused on what was happening demographically in Sweden. This was already before World War II, and then after World War II, these people were still around, of course, and they were the ones who then drove the discussion after the war in the 1950s. And it was in this sense, I think two things had to happen. The first that had to happen was a pension reform, because the pension system before the war was no more than a very small guarantee pension for everyone, and it was in 1960 after three rounds of investigations and committee hearings and all of this, there was finally a new pension system introduced in 1960, and this was it's called the ATP pension. We no longer have it, but I'll tell you in just a second why. It was a pay-as-you-go pension scheme, and it was introduced so as to provide good pensions for people who did not have the opportunity to have long working careers before the World War began and disrupted everything. So it was a sort of a transitional sort of pension scheme, although at the time it was viewed as being permanent, but it turned out not to be. But at the same time, then the same economists, etc., and with their political interests, also then said that we will introduce a new pay-as-you-go reform in 1960, which went through the parliament and became the pension system. But then also they said that because of this great number of persons born in conjunction with the end of World War II and thereafter for about 20 years, actually, we're going to have to save some money and build up a pension fund in order to pay for their pensions in the future. And indirectly, that meant that they would be paying for their own pensions by paying taxes to put money into the pension fund. So in a sense, it was then like a financial pension scheme, but it was at the aggregate country level. So people didn't have their own pension accounts in any sense in this way, but all the taxpayers' money, a certain percent went into this pension fund called the AP pension fund, introduced also in 1960. And of course, the goal was then to save money in order to be able to afford better the pensions for this large group of people when they were to become pensioners around the year 2010. So it was a lot of foresight, I should say, and the government managed not to take the money and spend it on something else, which is a general risk in any country, even in Sweden. but they didn't do it because this was the pension fund. These are people's pensions in the future. And it actually was successful. In 1999, we reformed the pension scheme because the scheme that we'd introduced in 1960 was easy to show would be demographically bankrupt anyway. And so it was important to do something about it. It would actually, the period of when the bankruptcy would come would be about the same time as this group of people born right after the Second World War were to become pensioners. And so this was not, of course, nobody wanted that to happen. And we not only then had this big pension fund, which was there to help this group of people, but also we had a pension reform, introduced something called non-financial defined contribution, NDC pensions, in 1999, and that's where we are today. The pension fund was left intact. Initially, it began by investing very much in government bonds and what conservative pension funds usually do. But then from the 1980s, it began also to invest money in the Swedish stock market, and it's still doing it. Anyway, so that the fund is now has been working as it was intended to work from the year 2000, around 2010, starting to help to pay for this larger number of persons who are becoming pensioners, the ones who were born, well, from 1945, 1950, 1955, actually into 1960. And so that, and this is, the fund has existed all of the time, and the fund has actually been extremely successful afterwards. There was one point actually in 1999 when the government did take some of the money in order to pay off some of the government debt in order to join the European Union, because there was a requirement on the amount of debt you could have at that time. Not that any country normally follows that anymore, but that was it when Sweden was entering, it was important. So, but other than that, the fund has remained intact, and it's actually now it's the NDC pension fund, and it is the money is handled by this fund. So it has actually, the fund has 4 funds, and these funds invest independently in the stock market and in other government bond investments, etc. And they're still doing it. And as recently as 2020, I should say that the fund, well, from 2010 to 2020, this fund, all of the interest on the funds, which, as you know, particularly in 2020, was about a 30% rate of return for the stock market, which was great for this pension fund too. On the other hand, the pension fund took a small dive at the same time as the stock market took a dive in 2021, 22, and is the January 2022, but it only declined by 10%, whereas a normal private pension fund, many of them declined by 30%. So that they managed it very well. The money has been there. It has financed it's actually financed considerably pensions, but at the same time, the pensions fund is still increasing, which is interesting. So that the money which is actually is being used to pay for pensions is the money which constitutes the return on the fund's investments. So almost all the return has been going to this extra number of pensioners, which was, of course, from 2010, and is still going on and will continue to go on for a while. But then eventually this will then turn into another demographic event at the end, and this is at the end, and say about 20 more years. And this is when then all of this group of persons will have died out, more or less. There There might be a few left who are older 90-year-olds, but there won't be many. And that means that the smaller group of births, which came in the 1970s, because that was actually half of the 1970s was the second half was a recession, so was the first half of the 1980s. And that means that there weren't so many babies born because at least in Sweden, people don't have babies when the economic times are not good. And that's what the data tells us. So that anyways, that this sort of a demographic up and down, if you want to say, is going to continue into the future. So we'll have about 20 years of large cohorts and then 20 years of smaller cohorts, etc., because of births, which will be the smaller cohorts. They have the same birth rate, but there are fewer of them, so they have fewer children. And that's the bottom line. The system has worked, and it's still intact, and the AP fund is still investing. And these days, it's actually a very important investor in Sweden. But even a large percent is invested in foreign stock markets. And I think that's the end of the story. But it's been a successful story, and I was really impressed myself when I was a young economist, and I learned all of this, that this had been done in the 1950s, more or less, planned, executed, and politicians actually let it continue. And that's the story of the AP fund in Sweden. AP fund means it's the Universal Pension Fund for the people. And that's what it's been.
Y estos ahorros de los que has hablado, de que se han venido acumulando durante tantos años, ¿qué representan hoy en relación al PIB? Y sobre todo, ¿han cumplido su objetivo? ¿Son suficientes para afrontar el gasto que ya está ocasionando el baby boom sueco?
Okay. That's an interesting question too, and as it turns out, it's not strange because I'm a pension economist, and so I've been doing very much research in pensions, and I've been most recently in 2020, I was the co-editor of a book published by the World Bank, and it has two volumes, which together are about 600 pages about Europe's and the rest of the world's pension systems. And I can say that in that context, I can say two things. In December of 2021, which is actually a little after this was published in 2020, but nevertheless, 1 year after, the fund had reached $200 billion in size. And so then, as I discuss in this article, which is in the World Bank book in 2020, now the question is the fund too big? And of course, it's a hard question to answer, of course, because to begin with, when the question was asked, if you asked the question, say in January of 2022, then you kind of followed it after that, the fund actually declined by about 20% due to the stock market. I mean, most of the money it's not in just the Swedish stock market, but it's in the European and the international stock market. And so it followed the development of the stock market, which is not strange for a fund, which is supposed to be doing that. But it has recovered since then, relatively. It's following the stock market still. But even given that, the calculations that are not only made, that are actually made by the pensions agency in Sweden every year on behalf of the government, they still show that the main problem in the future is going to be we will have too much money in the fund, and it's a nice problem to have. And the NDC scheme is completely separate from the government budget. So that's the whole idea with the NDC scheme, is that it's autonomous, it takes care of itself, and it does. but even part of taking care of itself, as I mentioned, was it has been using money from the pension fund also, but that was the intention. And so this sort of cyclical development that is connected now to the cyclical development in the composition of the population is going to continue, so that there'll always, if everything remains as it is, then there are two working age populations supporting one pension age population, more or less, if you divide everything up into 20-year groups. And this means that that it's going to just continue financing itself, because there's always a group of persons who are a bigger group because their grandfathers and grandmothers were also a bigger group, even though their parents were not a bigger group. But there's always one group, which is interesting. I'd never thought of it until I started to think about it in this context. But it's interesting, and that means that the whole system is very stable, and the only problem is perhaps that it is doing too well. And which is important, because that then raises the question: should maybe the fund's money be distributed among pensioners of all age, of all birth cohorts in the future? And then that you would have to have a plan for that, of course, and in order to do that, but to let the fund remain and perform its basic function, which is keep the system stable. And that could be the future discussion in Sweden.
Muchísimas gracias por tus respuestas, Ed.